In 1790, when most intellectuals across Europe celebrated what they believed to be the dawn of a new age of reason and liberty, I penned what many considered the most unpopular book of its time. While philosophers and politicians hailed the French Revolution as humanity's greatest triumph, I saw something entirely different, a catastrophe unfolding with mathematical precision. My Reflections on the Revolution in France was not merely criticism, it was prophecy based on decades of parliamentary experience and deep understanding of human nature. I predicted that this supposed liberation would descend into terror, tyranny, and ultimately military despotism. My contemporaries dismissed me as an old reactionary clinging to obsolete prejudices. Yet within 3 years, the guillotine was claiming thousands of innocent lives. Within a decade, Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. How did I foresee what brilliant minds missed? The answer lies not in supernatural vision, but in applying timeless principles of political prudence to revolutionary claims. Today, as America faces its own revolutionary pressures, understanding why the French experiment failed, and why I saw its failure coming, offers invaluable wisdom for preserving genuine liberty through constitutional means rather than destructive upheaval. Chapter 1: The Fatal Flaw: Abstract Rights Without Historical Foundation. The fundamental error that doomed the French Revolution from its inception was its reliance upon abstract philosophical principles divorced from historical experience and practical wisdom. When the National Assembly proclaimed the rights of man and citizen, they believed they were establishing universal truths that would guide humanity toward perfect justice. I recognized immediately that they were constructing a political system on metaphysical sand. Rights, as I understood from years observing the development of English liberty, are not abstract philosophical concepts but practical arrangements that emerge from centuries of struggle, compromise, and gradual refinement. The liberties we cherish, trial by jury, habeas corpus, parliamentary representation, were not discovered through philosophical speculation but forged through historical experience. Each right represents a solution to specific historical problems, tested by time and proven effective through practice. The French revolutionaries, intoxicated by Enlightenment philosophy, believed they could engineer a perfect society by reasoning from first principles. They assumed that human nature was essentially good and that removing traditional restraints would unleash natural virtue. This represented a catastrophic misunderstanding of both human nature and political reality. My parliamentary experience had taught me that even well-intentioned people, when freed from traditional constraints and historical wisdom, often produce consequences opposite to their intentions. Consider their declaration's assertion that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. While this sounds noble, it ignores the complex reality that meaningful freedom requires institutions, traditions, and practices that channel human energy constructively. Abstract equality, imposed without regard for historical development or social complexity, destroys the intricate relationships that make genuine liberty possible. I predicted that this abstract approach would lead to increasingly radical measures because reality would constantly contradict their theories. When their philosophical principles failed to produce the promised results, they would blame insufficient purity rather than flawed premises. This dynamic would drive them toward ever more extreme positions, ultimately destroying the very liberty they claimed to champion. The English approach, by contrast, had developed organically over centuries. Our liberties were not declared but earned, not theorized but lived. Each generation inherited rights from their ancestors and passed them, hopefully improved, to their descendants. This created what I called a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born, a continuity that revolutionary France deliberately severed. Chapter 2: The Terror Was Inevitable: Why Revolution Devours Its Children. From my parliamentary experience observing factional politics, I understood that revolutionary movements contain internal dynamics that inevitably lead to escalating extremism. The French Revolution's descent into terror was not an unfortunate accident but a predictable consequence of abandoning traditional restraints and constitutional limitations on power. When revolutionaries declare that they are creating an entirely new society based on pure reason, they simultaneously declare that anyone who opposes them opposes reason itself. This transforms political disagreement into moral heresy. I foresaw that once this logic took hold, moderation would become impossible. Those who counseled prudence would be branded as enemies of the people, and each faction would be driven to prove its revolutionary purity by outdoing the extremism of its rivals. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 confirmed my darkest predictions. By killing their king, the revolutionaries crossed a threshold from which there could be no peaceful return. They had declared war not merely on the old regime but on the entire principle of historical continuity and traditional authority. This act would require them to defend their revolution against all internal and external enemies through increasingly desperate measures. I had witnessed how parliamentary factions, even within constitutional constraints, could drive each other to extreme positions. Remove those constraints entirely, add the intoxication of absolute power, and the result becomes inevitable. Each revolutionary leader would be forced to prove his loyalty by denouncing yesterday's heroes as today's traitors. Danton, who helped destroy the monarchy, would himself be destroyed by Robespierre. Robespierre, the incorruptible champion of virtue, would fall to Thermidor. The revolution would literally devour its children. The Committee of Public Safety's reign of terror validated my understanding that concentrated power, especially power justified by abstract ideology, tends toward tyranny regardless of initial intentions. When government claims to represent the general will, rather than being constrained by constitutional forms, it recognizes no limits on its authority. Every opposition becomes treason, every tradition becomes superstition, every dissent becomes counter-revolution. I predicted that this dynamic would continue until exhaustion forced France to accept any leader strong enough to restore order, regardless of his respect for the revolutionary principles that brought him to power. The path from revolutionary idealism to military despotism was not accidental but inherent in the revolutionary logic itself. This is why I consistently argued that meaningful reform must work through existing institutions rather than attempting to create entirely new ones. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary government, and traditional forms provided restraints that prevented any faction from claiming absolute authority. Revolution, by destroying these restraints, unleashed forces that no human wisdom could control. Chapter 3: The Economics of Destruction. How revolutionary finance predicted collapse. My years observing parliamentary debates over taxation and public finance had taught me that a nation's fiscal policies reveal the sustainability of its political system. When I examined the French Revolution's financial measures, I saw clear evidence that their entire project was economically impossible and would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions. The assignats, revolutionary paper money backed by confiscated church and noble lands, represented everything dangerous about revolutionary economic thinking. The Assembly believed they could solve France's fiscal crisis by simply printing money secured by property they had seized. This revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth is created and preserved in civilized society. Real wealth depends on confidence, credit, and the security of property rights developed over generations. When government seizes property arbitrarily, even for supposedly just reasons, it destroys the foundation of economic trust that makes complex commerce possible. I predicted that the assignats would rapidly depreciate because no rational person would have confidence in currency backed by stolen property and issued by a government that recognized no constitutional limits on its power. The revolutionary government's attempts to control this inflation through price controls, the law of the maximum, confirmed my analysis that they understood neither economic reality nor human nature. Declaring that bread should cost a certain amount cannot make grain grow faster or millers work for unprofitable wages. Such measures inevitably create shortages, black markets, and social unrest that require increasingly authoritarian responses. I foresaw that revolutionary France would face a stark choice: either abandon their economic experiments and restore property rights and constitutional government, or resort to ever more desperate measures including external conquest to seize wealth they could not create domestically. The Directory's aggressive wars and eventual rise of Napoleon represented attempts to solve internal contradictions through military expansion, a pattern I had observed in other revolutionary movements. The contrast with English economic development was instructive. Our national debt, though large, was secured by parliamentary consent, constitutional government, and respect for property rights that encouraged voluntary investment. French debt had been secured only by royal authority that revolution had destroyed. Our currency was backed by the accumulated wealth and confidence of centuries, theirs by confiscated property and revolutionary promises. My parliamentary experience with colonial trade disputes had shown me that sustainable economic growth requires predictable legal frameworks and respect for existing contracts. Revolutionary France's economic policies systematically destroyed both. Each radical measure made investors less willing to risk capital in French enterprises, creating a vicious cycle of economic decline that no amount of revolutionary enthusiasm could overcome. This economic analysis reinforced my broader argument that successful political systems must respect historical development rather than attempting to create entirely new arrangements based on abstract theory. Chapter 4: The Religious Question: Why Attacking Christianity Guaranteed Revolutionary Failure. From my parliamentary observations of religious questions in Ireland and my study of human societies, I understood that attacking established religion represents political suicide for any movement claiming to represent the people. The French Revolution's systematic assault on Christianity revealed both philosophical arrogance and practical stupidity that made their ultimate failure inevitable. The constitutional clergy decree, requiring priests to swear loyalty to revolutionary principles rather than traditional religious authority, demonstrated how revolutionaries misunderstood the relationship between religious faith and social order. They imagined they could simply transfer religious loyalty from church to state through legislative decree. This revealed their fundamental ignorance of how religious conviction actually operates in human hearts and communities. I predicted that this policy would divide France irreconcilably between those who accepted revolutionary religious innovations and those who remained loyal to traditional Catholic practice. No government can survive when it deliberately alienates the religious convictions of the majority of its citizens. The Vaude Rebellion and other counter-revolutionary movements would inevitably emerge from this religious persecution, creating internal wars that would drain revolutionary resources and undermine their claims to represent popular will. The cult of reason and subsequent cult of the supreme being confirmed my analysis that revolutionaries understood neither human nature nor the social functions of religion. They believed they could manufacture substitute religions through philosophical speculation and theatrical ceremonies. This demonstrated the same abstract thinking that characterized all their political errors, assuming that human beings would embrace artificial construction simply because they appeared rational to revolutionary intellectuals. My parliamentary experience had taught me that religious establishment, properly understood, provides moral authority independent of political power. This creates essential checks on governmental tyranny and provides social cohesion that transcends immediate political divisions. By destroying this independent moral authority, French revolutionaries removed crucial restraints on their own power while simultaneously undermining the moral consensus necessary for stable society. The de-Christianization campaign revealed revolutionary totalitarianism in its purest form. Not content with political revolution, they demanded revolution in conscience, morality, and ultimate spiritual allegiance. This inevitably provoked resistance from ordinary people who might have accepted political reforms but could not abandon religious convictions central to their identity and hope. I foresaw that this religious persecution would create permanent enemies of the revolution among the most humble and devout citizens, precisely those whose support any stable government requires. Aristocrats might be defeated militarily, but persecuted religious believers would maintain underground resistance indefinitely, making normal governmental administration impossible. The contrast with English religious development was again instructive. Our glorious revolution had preserved established Christianity while extending toleration to dissenting Protestant groups. This created religious peace while maintaining moral authority independent of political power. French revolutionaries, by contrast, attempted to subordinate all moral authority to political ideology, ensuring permanent conflict between revolutionary government and Christian conscience. Chapter 5: International Folly: How Revolutionary War Spread Chaos Across Europe. My decades of parliamentary experience with foreign policy, particularly regarding American colonial relations, had taught me that successful diplomacy requires understanding other nations' internal complexities and respecting established international arrangements. The French Revolution's approach to foreign relations guaranteed that their internal chaos would spread across Europe and ultimately destroy them. When revolutionary France declared war on traditional European monarchies, they believed they were liberating oppressed peoples from tyrannical governments. This represented the same abstract thinking that had produced domestic catastrophe, assuming that all peoples shared identical aspirations and that traditional governments everywhere lacked legitimate authority. My parliamentary experience had shown me that each nation's political arrangements reflect unique historical development that cannot be understood through revolutionary theories. The declaration of Pillnitz and subsequent European coalition against France were predictable responses to revolutionary aggression, not evidence of monarchical conspiracy against liberty. When any government proclaims universal principles that delegitimize all existing authorities and actively encourages revolution in neighboring countries, those neighbors will naturally form defensive alliances. The French revolutionaries created their own international enemies through ideological arrogance. I foresaw that revolutionary war would accelerate domestic radicalization by providing convenient explanations for internal failures. Every economic problem could be blamed on foreign enemies, every political opposition denounced as treasonous collaboration with external foes. This dynamic would drive France toward increasingly authoritarian measures justified by military necessity, ultimately destroying the very liberty revolution claimed to champion. The levée en masse, universal military conscription, confirmed my prediction that revolutionary ideology would produce unprecedented governmental power over individual citizens. Previous European wars had been fought by professional armies with limited political objectives. Revolutionary France militarized its entire society in service of ideological goals, creating a model of total war that would plague Europe for generations. My analysis of colonial relations had shown me that sustainable international arrangements require mutual respect for legitimate interests and gradual diplomatic adjustment of conflicts. Revolutionary France's approach, demanding immediate universal acceptance of their principles, made peaceful coexistence impossible and guaranteed prolonged warfare that would exhaust all participants. The revolutionary export of political chaos through military conquest demonstrated how abstract ideology produces practical catastrophe. Each liberated territory faced the same choice between accepting revolutionary innovations or becoming enemies of the liberating army. This created permanent instability across Europe as local populations were forced to choose between traditional loyalties and revolutionary allegiance. I predicted that this international adventure would eventually produce a military strongman who would exploit foreign conquest to justify domestic tyranny. Napoleon's rise represented not a betrayal of revolutionary principles but their logical culmination, concentrated power justified by ideological mission and sustained through continuous warfare against external enemies. The contrast with English imperial development was significant. Our colonial expansion, however imperfect, had generally respected local institutions and aimed at mutually beneficial commercial relationships rather than ideological transformation. This approach, while sometimes producing conflicts like the American crisis, avoided the total warfare that revolutionary ideology made inevitable. Chapter 6: Constitutional Destruction: Why Legal Revolution Became Lawless Tyranny. My parliamentary career had provided extensive education in constitutional development and the crucial importance of legal continuity for maintaining legitimate government. The French Revolution's approach to constitutional questions revealed fundamental misunderstandings that guaranteed their descent into arbitrary rule and ultimate collapse. The tennis court oath, while dramatically symbolic, represented the fatal decision to abandon existing constitutional forms in favor of revolutionary innovation. The Third Estate's declaration that they constituted the National Assembly denied the legitimate authority of established institutions and claimed to derive their power directly from abstract popular sovereignty. This rejected centuries of French constitutional development in favor of theoretical constructions that had never been tested by experience. I predicted that this constitutional rupture would create permanent legitimacy problems for any revolutionary government. Without roots in historical precedent and established legal tradition, their authority would always depend on force rather than consent. Each new constitution, and France would produce several, would face the same dilemma: either respect previous legal arrangements and abandon revolutionary innovations, or maintain revolutionary principles and accept the arbitrary rule that inevitably follows from rejecting constitutional restraints. The execution of Louis XVI completed this constitutional destruction by severing the last link with traditional legal authority. Whatever the king's personal faults, the monarchy represented institutional continuity that connected present government with historical development. By destroying this connection, revolutionaries eliminated the possibility of legitimate succession and condemned France to permanent constitutional instability. My parliamentary experience had shown me that constitutional government requires accepted procedures for peaceful transfer of power and recognized limits on governmental authority. The French revolutionaries, by claiming unlimited power to transform society according to rational principles, destroyed both requirements. Their governments would inevitably face the choice between abandoning their revolutionary mission or ruling through force alone. The law of 22 Prairial, accelerating death sentences during the Terror, confirmed my prediction that revolutionary government tends toward increasingly arbitrary rule. When authority derives from abstract ideology rather than constitutional tradition, there are no agreed-upon limits on governmental power. Every opposition becomes treason, every legal protection becomes an obstacle to revolutionary justice. Every traditional restraint becomes counter-revolutionary obstruction. I foresaw that this constitutional chaos would eventually force France to accept any leader capable of imposing order, regardless of his respect for revolutionary principles or constitutional limitations. Napoleon's coup of 18 Brumaire represented not an aberration but the inevitable result of destroying constitutional traditions without creating sustainable alternatives. The contrast with English constitutional development demonstrated the wisdom of gradual reform within existing frameworks. Our glorious revolution had preserved constitutional monarchy while adjusting the balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority. This maintained legal continuity while achieving necessary reforms, avoiding the chaos that follows constitutional destruction. The American Revolution, which I had supported, succeeded precisely because it preserved English constitutional principles while adapting them to colonial circumstances. The Americans claimed historical rights rather than abstract theories, maintained legal procedures even during warfare, and created new institutions based on established precedents rather than revolutionary innovation. Chapter 7: The American Alternative: Constitutional Revolution versus Destructive Upheaval. My parliamentary defense of American colonial rights had taught me the crucial distinction between legitimate resistance to tyrannical policies and revolutionary destruction of constitutional order. The American Revolution succeeded precisely because it preserved essential constitutional principles while correcting specific abuses, a model that French revolutionaries tragically rejected in favor of total transformation based on abstract theory. The American colonists, in their resistance to British policies I had opposed in Parliament, consistently grounded their arguments in established English constitutional principles rather than revolutionary innovations. Their Declaration of Independence listed specific grievances against particular policies rather than proclaiming universal rights that would delegitimize all existing governments. This constitutional approach enabled them to maintain legal and moral authority while resisting tyrannical measures. I had argued in Parliament that American resistance was actually conservative, defending traditional English liberties against novel parliamentary claims to unlimited authority over colonial affairs. The colonists sought to preserve constitutional arrangements that had developed over generations rather than creating entirely new political systems based on philosophical speculation. This distinguished their movement fundamentally from French revolutionary ideology. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 demonstrated how genuine constitutional wisdom operates. Rather than proclaiming abstract rights, the American founders created practical institutions based on historical experience and designed to channel human ambition constructively. Their system of checks and balances reflected understanding of human nature and political reality that French revolutionaries conspicuously lacked. American federalism particularly impressed me as a solution to the problem of governing diverse territories without destroying local institutions and traditions. Unlike French centralization, which sought to impose uniform revolutionary principles on all provinces, American federalism preserved local autonomy while creating effective national government for genuinely national concerns. The American approach to religious questions also contrasted favorably with French anti-religious persecution. While establishing no national church, Americans preserved the moral authority of religious institutions and recognized religion's essential role in maintaining public virtue. This avoided the social conflict that religious persecution created in France while preventing any single denomination from claiming political supremacy. Most significantly, Americans maintained constitutional government even during warfare, demonstrating that revolutionary change need not destroy legal tradition and institutional continuity. George Washington's voluntary relinquishment of power established precedents for peaceful succession that French revolutionaries never achieved, despite their elaborate constitutional theorizing. The American success validated my argument that meaningful political reform must work through existing constitutional forms rather than attempting total transformation. By preserving English legal traditions while adapting them to American circumstances, the founders created stable institutions that could evolve gradually rather than requiring periodic revolutionary upheaval. This comparison illuminated why I could support American resistance while opposing French Revolution. The Americans sought to restore constitutional balance that British policies had disturbed, while French revolutionaries sought to destroy constitutional tradition entirely. One approach preserved liberty through law, the other sacrificed law to abstract ideology. The enduring success of American institutions, compared to French constitutional instability, confirmed my conviction that political wisdom must be based on historical experience rather than philosophical speculation, and that genuine progress comes through prudent reform rather than revolutionary destruction. Conclusion. History vindicated every prediction I made about the French Revolution's inevitable failure because I based my analysis on timeless principles of political prudence rather than contemporary enthusiasm. The Revolution's descent into terror, economic collapse, military despotism, and ultimate restoration demonstrated that human nature and political reality cannot be transformed through abstract reasoning and revolutionary will. My prophecy succeeded not through supernatural insight but through applying lessons learned from decades of parliamentary experience to revolutionary claims. I understood that sustainable political arrangements must emerge from historical development rather than philosophical speculation, that meaningful liberty requires constitutional restraints rather than unlimited democracy, and that successful reform must preserve institutional continuity while correcting specific abuses. The French tragedy offers crucial warnings for contemporary America as our own revolutionary pressures intensify. Those demanding fundamental transformation of American institutions repeat the same errors that destroyed revolutionary France, believing that abstract principles can replace historical wisdom, that current arrangements lack legitimacy because they fail to match theoretical ideals, and that concentrated power can be safely entrusted to leaders who share their ideological convictions. America's founders understood what French revolutionaries ignored, that constitutional government requires accepted limits on all authority, including popular authority, and that genuine liberty depends on institutional arrangements that channel human ambition constructively rather than unleashing it destructively. The choice before us remains the same that faced 18th century Europe: prudent reform within constitutional traditions, or revolutionary destruction that leads inevitably to tyranny and chaos. The wisdom of political prudence never becomes obsolete because human nature never changes. Those who learn from historical experience can avoid repeating historical catastrophes, while those who trust in revolutionary innovation condemn themselves to rediscover ancient truths through contemporary suffering.